A very warm welcome to all our esteemed alumni, educators, and guests joining us for part two of the five-part United Board Alumni Webinar series on balancing innovation and integrity, developing ethical guidelines for AI use in education. We encourage you to actively participate, share experiences, and collaborate with us as we work together to take these issues forward. Thank you for joining us today. I will now hand over to Mr. Christian On, our Educational Technology Officer, to introduce the speaker of the day. Over to you, Christian.
It's really my great pleasure to introduce you to our Professor Rachel Robertson. She's an assistant professor at the Academy of Chinese History, Religion, and Philosophy at the Hong Kong Business University. And she has been actually working with us in creating the course called Introduction to Digital Ethics. So this course is co-organized between Hong Kong Business University and United Board. And this is the online certificate course. And we have been working together for the past year in creating this course. And I really had the privilege to get to know Professor Rachel. And she has been invaluable resource person for us in the regards of digital ethics. And that's why I also invited Rachel to come and speak for us for our second webinar. And I really hope that this session will give you a lot of insights on digital ethics and also how to balance between innovation and digital ethics, right? So please join me. Welcome Professor Rachel for her insights with us today.
Thank you so much, Christian, everybody at the United Board. It's a real honor to be back with you. I see some familiar names in the chat as well from the digital ethics course, and it's great to see some new people saying hi as we go. I just wanted to open with some examples of AI. So when we say AI, artificial intelligence, it can mean a lot of things nowadays. I think we may no longer think of the kind of robots or Terminator style AI anymore. I think nowadays we're quite used to the idea, a lot of us, of AI being in a variety of tools, maybe. But just to get us all on the same page, I'm thinking about lots of different things that use artificial systems which try to mimic some kind of human decision-making or cognitive skill. So that could look like virtual assistants like Siri, conversational systems like ChatGPT, where you type something in, it gives you an answer back. Recommender engines is probably a more historic now use of AI. Things that underlie search engine rankings, social media posts, what comes to the top of your news feed, in Facebook, Instagram, that sort of thing. Then more recently, this big boom in AI generating and editing media, audio, code, text, images, videos, even whole lesson designs and plans, presentations, websites. Big amount of data handling as well, whether that's generating data to in turn train AI, analyzing, visualizing data in your own disciplines. Maybe that's what you use AI for, or if you've heard of such use. Enhancing productivity, so things embedded in Microsoft, for example, email, trying to use AI to enhance productivity. Learning tools specifically which use AI, like language learning apps, or maybe simulating difficult interactions using AI, so pretending to talk to somebody in a very dangerous situation or something like that. And then a whole range of accessibility related tools. So I'm thinking of things like handwriting recognition, voice to text, text to speech, translation, and so on. So let's just have this full range. I think that's the first important thing as we get into talking about ethics of AI. When we have this whole range of uses of AI, it can be hard to think how to think through it, and also why think ethically about these uses. I think as we list them, it seems like there's a lot of variety, a lot of opportunities out there. So to just get us started thinking, I wanted to present three contrasting pictures. And if you want to follow along and make notes on a document, I think Christian and the team have shared this in the resources section of our Zoom call. So you can download a PDF, all the slides, and a worksheet that we'll look at later on as well. But here are these three pictures that I want to talk about. The first is a bulldozer and a hammer contrasted with each other. And this is something that I take from the wonderful A People's Guide to AI. It's a free guide, very simple yet very powerful. And one thing that the authors write about is this picture of AI as a bulldozer. So just quoting from them, they say, right now, AI is designed and implemented by large companies or governments. It's a tool, but not a common one that everyone can use like a hammer. Like a bulldozer, it's something you need special training to work with and lots of money and resources to use on a meaningful level. So there's our first picture, contrasting bulldozer and a hammer. You might think of other associations that I think are useful when we think of AI as a bulldozer. It's a blunt but highly technical instrument. You might think of it as having destructive power, incredible destructive power, perhaps even constructive power though, too. But I think the point here is that it is something that requires expertise to use on a meaningful level. Second picture, something that really sparked my own thinking about technology in general. It's from work by Sophia Noble. So I thought about the bulldozer and the hammer. The second contrasting picture that I want to think about is the plain page versus the colorful spectrum. So this thinks more about what's the default setting for AI-assisted technologies. And Sophia Noble, she writes about search engines, and she thinks about the standard look for a search engine as a white page, plain, and then you get lots of ranked items. And nowadays you get this AI overview at the top too. And she suggests, well, what if it looked completely different when you searched for something? What have you got? Apologies, this isn't colorful. I wasn't able to find the color version, but you can imagine a color wheel, lots of different results arranged according to your purpose and interest of where these web pages are from. And Sophia Noble suggests that this would be one way to make the default, not that you get a whole range of things, but you have to opt in to your various biases. Whether or not you think this is effective, I think the interesting thing that she notes is that in some ways we need to denaturalize and reconsider the standards for presenting information to the public. And her challenge is that we should slow down the automation of our worst impulses. The third picture that I want to consider is a contrast between AI in abundance and AI within limits. This is something from an education researcher, Neil Selwyn. And he contrasts this image, tried to find some appropriate picture of this assumption that we have plenty. And digital technologies like AI, we need to personally own them, frequently upgrade them. Classroom needs to be full of them. There's a one-to-one ratio, at least, of one device per student. Instant continuous access, unlimited and eternal storage, high bandwidth connections, and content stored in multiple versions and shared repeatedly. This picture of abundance. And Neil Selwyn contrasts this with an assumption of limits, a reduction of resource usage, and a renewed focus on social equity sufficiency. So here the contrast is between what are we starting from and working with AI? Are we in a world where we have a lot and each person should have a lot personally? Or are we actually working within limits? Does there need to be a reduction and some sharing that goes on too? But what am I trying to say by putting up these two contrasts, these pairs? Basically, this is my main thing. Apologies if you've heard me talk before. I feel like I always say this thing. This is my theme. Digital ethics in education. Why I think about the ethics of AI in education. Ethics moves us beyond harnessing or mitigating what is. So you might think of these images on the left, the bulldozer, the assumption that there's neutrality and things can be ranked, or this sitting on top of a pile of abundance. Ethics moves us beyond this, either wanting to harness it or maybe wanting to mitigate it. Either you think it's positive or negative. I think ethics moves us beyond that and towards forming and acting in line with a moral vision of what should be. And these are some suggestions, the contrasting images, this kind of spectrum of results, acknowledging the position, a specialized, meaningful tool that is available to everyone, and limitation, working within scarcity. These are some alternative moral visions of what should be. And for us as educators, that's doing that according to our own educational resources and positions. You must come from a variety of disciplines and backgrounds, and all of those can be at work informing that moral vision, and enacting it too. And that's what we're going to explore in a little bit more detail today. So I'm going to think a bit about the theoretical framework that I'm offering from ethics. Then I'm going to talk about the usual challenges and opportunities, and then the usual solutions that are suggested in light of that. I'm going to introduce a few concepts about why I think in some ways it's worse than we usually assume, but also better. And that there are some solutions that maybe you haven't heard of before or applied to AI in particular. And then we'll finish up with a look at a worksheet that guides us through drafting a policy for AI use, maybe at an institutional level or maybe even within your classroom too. So let's start off with this theoretical framework. I want to talk a little bit about ethics technically. This idea I've introduced of having this moral vision, what does that involve? So we're going to start off with that. So basically, for me, I think there's many ways to approach ethics. I'm just giving you one that I use to make sense of this situation. I like to set the general context. So in our world today, our students, we ourselves, our communities, many things that we are facing, ecological crises, unfamiliar job markets, heightened polarization. You can probably think of other issues that are relevant to your context. And the digital world, I don't think it creates problems, but it certainly exacerbates them. And although there are opportunities, there are also risks. And so the task is to approach this as a whole, see all of these problems as interconnected, and prepare people in education for facing up to this digital world, or even just the world. And I'm speaking from my own context. I work in higher education in an English language instruction context in Hong Kong. So my thoughts are often with my students who have a particular socioeconomic background. They are working in a language which is probably not their first language. And there are some issues unique to them that shape how I think of AI. So it's worth thinking about your own context too. Who are your students, your colleagues, your community? What are their needs and what are their risks? But in general, my approach is, as I said, we need to acquire and act on moral vision. Now, what kind of moral vision? I think well-being is a really helpful place to start. So having a moral vision of well-being, and especially digital well-being. Digital well-being is a technical term in education studies. It refers to how people act and feel when they're using digital technologies, as well as what they can do with technology to have a positive influence. And well-being has different levels as well. I think it's helpful to think not just at the personal level, which includes the physical and psychological well-being, like vision, sleep cycle, mental health, all of that. Important, but there's also a societal level of wellness, which is about harmony in social groups. So you could think about, for example, how sharing information by technology shapes societies, how they interact. And then importantly, there's this higher level of planetary wellness, which refers to the well-being of the Earth and ecosystems. So you could think about the impact of the production, the use, and the upkeep and disposal of technologies, and especially AI-related technologies. And these levels are interdependent. I think it's hard to just isolate. Often we think about personal wellness, but for example, personal and planetary wellness, I think we're all aware, is very interconnected. So even at a sort of mental health level, especially for young people now, anxiety through interacting with environmental disasters, is one way. And then in the other direction, if you encounter lots of misinformation about the climate emergency, that could perhaps hinder planetary wellness. You could hinder cooperation towards solutions, for example. So lots of levels of well-being. Having a moral vision is to take these into account. That's my starting point. And how do we do this? I think there's many pathways towards supporting well-being. One that I appreciate and I think it's useful as educators to think about is an emphasis on supporting virtue or character. So what is virtue or character? It's not just about sort of quirks of a personality or something like that. It's about qualities, dispositions, and behaviors which allow for informed choices to do the right thing at the right time. And why this? It's because in ethics, these are considered to be traits which support well-being. I've written individual and societal, but perhaps even planetary well-being as well. And so it includes things like critical, moral, and creative skills, honesty, self-control, humility, creativity, and an overall unifying virtue of integrity. So that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about when we talk about supporting well-being. And I want to just highlight integrity for a moment because I think it's really useful as a kind of lowest common denominator, a way of thinking through character and technology. And integrity, you can think of it in different directions. So one is sort of from ourselves to the world. Are we receptive to the world, the things that are going on around us, to the moral demands that others place on us? That's one thing. And self-efficacy, so that's more about us to the world. Are we able to act effectively to change things in the world in accordance with our desires and our commitments? And then there's a sort of more internal version, which is self-unity, a kind of consistency of all our commitments and identities. And there's a lot of background literature on integrity in philosophy and psychology, and many people agree that supporting these varieties of integrity will result in an experience of well-being, perhaps even joy, as a deep and lasting positive emotion that results from the recognition and experience of integrity. So that's my approach using ethics. How can education which aims for virtue or character, and particularly integrity understood in these three ways, help people in education to build and act in line with a moral vision of the world? So I started with some contrasting pictures, and I suggested that we don't need to stop with what is, even though it's important to know what is the case and recognize risks and opportunities. We can form a moral vision, but what does that look like? We can aim for well-being by supporting virtue and character in education. So let's look at AI now. We thought very briefly about an overall approach, but what does all this talk of well-being, character, integrity look like when we try to think about AI in particular in education? And here's one way to try to organize everything that's been going on in the discourse about AI. I didn't want this talk just to be another talk saying that there are some benefits and there's some risks, because I feel like, I think even last time Christian very helpfully shared some surveys and some feedback from everyone. And in the chat, I saw people very well aware maybe as educators of some risks, some benefits, kind of weighing up, trying to navigate them. So I didn't want to repeat that, though if you're interested, I've put a lot of resources on the last page that you can read up on. But just to give us a way through, if we think about those three levels of integrity, there's already a lot of benefits, but also a lot of risks that we could think about. So epistemic integrity, which is about whether we can know about the world, whether we're aware of what's going on, whether we are recognizing the demands that we need to face up to. There might be some beneficial uses of AI. If you recall that full variety of tools that I mentioned, you can be thinking of tools for summarizing, pattern finding, translation, search, transcription, generating scripts for training, like empathy training, for example. I know examples of using AI for that. My own students, they like to turn their revision notes into other formats like quizzes or mind maps or even podcasts as they prepare for exams. And many more uses that all help them to come to form knowledge, to be more aware of what's going on. On the flip side of that, of course, are the well-known risks of AI as well. I think especially early uses of chat-based AI, where you type in a prompt and it gives you something back. There's been a lot of talk of so-called hallucinations, where AI is not working primarily as a search engine. It just generates a text or whatever media based on the training data that it's received. So it's not actually looking up things, it's just hallucinating. And often these don't match reality. There's connected with this problems of bias, so replicating whatever it finds in the training data. Then some perhaps malicious uses like deepfakes or driving things on social media or search engines, which contribute to people becoming very individualized or in their own sort of bubbles of what information they're finding. There's also a kind of barrier to knowledge in the black box nature of AI. What this means is that we don't know how AI came to its answers or the processes that went on to produce the media that it did. So even if it gets the right answer, we're not always sure why. And especially if it gets the wrong answer, we're also not sure why. There's also general worries about the impact of long-term use of AI in terms of a kind of intellectual de-skilling. So if we are turning first to various AI tools, especially prompting and getting the answer, do we lose some intellectual skills that we might have otherwise formed if we had to first look elsewhere or think for ourselves first? There's also what's known as the technological halo effect, and this has to do with even if the answers are wrong, there's something about AI, the search engine, all those interfaces where we interact with technology that is quite convincing. It sounds authoritative, and people tend to believe and prioritize that first. So there's this kind of halo effect around AI, which could impede us questioning it further, coming to our own opinions. Even if everything that AI told us is true, there's also kind of problem there that there's just unending information that you could receive as well. So how to prioritize, how to stop when enough is enough. And as I trace through all of these benefits and risks as well, I want to acknowledge that it's not just in the use of AI that there's a problem for knowledge. It's also for non-users of AI. So many people, perhaps some of you joining, don't have access, especially to the latest models, the fastest models of AI. Perhaps you feel like all these benefits and risks are quite distant to you because there's even a barrier to knowing about AI and accessing it in the first place. So I do want to acknowledge that too. Similarly with the other kinds of integrity then, so self-efficacy, this idea that you can act to change the world in accordance to your commitments. Many good examples, assistive technologies especially, more low-level examples like maybe if you're really struggling to redraft something to meet a word limit, maybe AI could offer a few suggestions. I find that the idea that there's a low-cost tool for my students, because we have an in-house AI that they can use is a sort of safety net for some of them who might not be confident with English. So I can tell them, just get your ideas down first. We'll look through several drafts together. And then at the end, if you want to, you can check your grammar. You can go through it, of course, with the provision that you need to check what AI says. It's not always right. But this seems to be quite helpful for my students. On the other hand, there's these risks, which are quite similar to what I've mentioned before. Whereas maybe intellectual de-skilling was an issue for the epistemic kind of integrity here, perhaps creativity and moral de-skilling, as we perhaps give over some of our agency to the outputs of AI. There's concerns about how our attention is captured and maybe commodified, especially I think with inputting a lot of our course materials into an AI-driven system as a whole. There are concerns about where student data is going as we collect a lot of data. All these AI systems generally work on collecting data about their users. Where is that all going? Does it then feed back into targeted ads and things like that, even well beyond their time at our universities, for example? Perhaps also sometimes AI makes thinking and work look too easy. Coming up with an answer, it seems to take only a few seconds, whereas coming to an informed opinion and actually acting to change something in the world can take a lot more effort. And again, just as with the knowledge of AI, I think there's also issues of inability to even access AI here too. Finally, self-unity. So I know a lot of teachers who use AI to generate scripts for meditation, reflection prompts, these kind of more reflective modes of thinking, maybe more individualized to the student in the classroom as well. But on the other hand, I think I want to emphasize this idea of individualization rather than personalization, because a lot of AI tools are very blunt. They just treat people as aggregated data. And there are concerns there that we're not really meeting each person as they are. There's a kind of standardization that might go on, perhaps a kind of moving towards everyone having to exhibit some sort of trait, which may not be true to who they are. These concerns about de-skilling as well, over-reliance, come up here too. And one thing, especially for my students, that I think about is their individual voice, their style, and their dialect. If they reroute all their writing and their speaking through AI in English, are they losing the opportunity to develop their own style, their way of thinking, their way of speaking and writing, academic work, and more technical work as well? So those are some thoughts, some categories. In the best case, for example, you could think of examples of students using AI to revitalize their own endangered languages. Lots of very interesting projects there. On the worst case side, you could think of people using deepfakes for exploiting people, the way that AI, especially in its highest quality, is only there for a few people in a country or perhaps between countries. And this overall extractive approach as well, I do want to note, built on very resource intensive in terms of the environment, cost, the water, the electricity, the minerals. A lot goes into making, training, and sustaining AI. A lot more, for example, compared to traditional search engines, which are not AI enhanced, for example. Now that they are AI enhanced, it kind of just increases that extraction. Also labor, there's also well-documented cases where a lot of these AI tools rely on very low-paid people labeling data and managing data as well. And an extractive approach to data too. So I'm sure if, as academics, perhaps you've thought about your own papers being used to train AI without your consent. But we could also think about our students. If we're feeding their work into an AI tool, where's that data going? Where's all this information about their learning habits going? from these kind of AI-enhanced systems. I do want to talk briefly about the usual kind of solutions that people would say when they think about these opportunities and risks. What can we do about it? One highly publicized approach is just to reject AI. I'm not sure if any of you are in that camp, but I'm thinking of things like banning, trying to detect AI, trying to return to traditional assessments like closed book and handwriting exams, which I think I put in a different category to other alternative approaches like oral examinations or creative outputs. I can talk a bit more about that if you want. And punishment, seeing AI use as cheating and punishing people by demanding that they attend extra exams, having a written warning, or maybe failing. And this is something that Christian mentioned, I think. We do need to balance this with problems that arise from a lack of access to AI as well. So there's issues for employability, for example. And this idea of an AI access gap in general is something of concern. So this was, for example, highlighted by the UN Secretary General in 2024, the idea that we should focus on bridging the AI access gap. So it is difficult if we are rejecting AI to deal with this dynamic of the problem of not having access to AI in the first place. I think it's easy to recommend rejection if it's an option, but often in talks that I've given or people I've interacted with, people often say, well, we can't even reject AI because it's not even an option for us. So how does that fit into this whole response to AI? Maybe on the other side of the spectrum, perhaps where most of you are, is this idea that we should keep up with the trajectory of AI use and development if we can. So focus on AI literacy, where you give students the skills and habits and practices to use AI well, like through critical thinking courses. Another option is AI collaboration, where you design learning experiences using AI, which encourage partnership with AI. So maybe the students will generate an AI draft and critique it, or maybe they will peer review each other's AI drafts. There's a program called AI Fix It, where this teacher can specify a particular error or bias, and students have to interact with it and try and figure it out and respond to it. And perhaps even further along this approach is AI design, where the educator focuses on inclusive design, perhaps universal design for learning or design justice, to try to undo the harms of AI as well. So there, perhaps things like language revitalization, where there's an awareness that AI models tend to prioritize majority languages and trying to shore up that gap and fill it in with revitalizing some language that's at risk. So a variety of responses there. I wonder which have you seen? I'm interested that as most of you seem to fall on a more positive side, which ones have you seen? Have you seen people rejecting AI in education? Have you seen people try to keep up through developing literacy, offering critical thinking courses? Have you maybe even used collaboration with AI as a skill? Do you engage in these kind of design justice projects using AI to fill a gap, perhaps one that is created by AI in the first place? Or I do want to acknowledge perhaps you're sitting here thinking, actually, this is already too far along. My students and myself, we don't even access AI, especially not in its better forms, in its high quality forms. Perhaps you can let us know which, if any, you've seen, or maybe you've been using it as well. Okay, so quite a lot of rejection. And then, yeah, I think this is quite common, literacy and collaboration. Yeah, interesting. Maybe not so much of this design justice kind of thinking. And perhaps for us, this lack of access is not the main issue. Well, I'm sure it is for some. Okay. And perhaps in your own classrooms, you can think, where do I fit on these standard responses? What's my attitude and where is that coming? Good. Okay, so in our remaining time, I'm aware it's already 45 minutes in. I just want to talk briefly through some extra suggestions for what you can do when you're thinking ethically about AI. So in one way, I want to suggest that the situation is worse than expected. So I've tried to give us these two options of the opportunities and the risks, the bulldozer and the hammer, these kind of contrasts. And you can use the technical term for them, techno-optimism about AI, seeing it as a solution, or techno-pessimism about AI, seeing it as the problem. And I think that being pulled in these directions is a kind of what we might call a tragic dilemma. It's hard to embrace the enhancement that comes with AI without trying to address the actual unpredicted harms of AI, especially the information disorder that goes on, and especially the extractive approach to the environment. I think this is something, as we use our technologies, and particularly AI, we are just sucking up water, power, land use, and so on. Perhaps not in our own countries, perhaps we're outsourcing it, but it's still happening. And so this is a tragic dilemma, I think, where there may not be an all things considered best thing to do. Maybe doing the right thing, it's impossible. And that's why I think many educators, if they're thoughtful about it and use of AI, they might feel a kind of pull, lack of being able to commit to AI, not sure about what to do with it. And this is a problem because it's a sort of disconnect between wanting to do the right thing and being able to achieve the state of well-being that I suggested we need to have in mind. And so that's my suggestion. We as educators, our students as well, are facing tragic dilemmas with AI. And I can talk a bit more about this in question and answer. I do think AI does add something new. I think we're always in a sort of tragic dilemma in life. It's hard to do the right thing. But there are features of AI that makes it even harder, given the way that it interacts with our action and widens that gap between those who have AI and those who do not have AI, yet may be seriously impacted by things like the environmental cost of AI. So if we're in this kind of tragic dilemma and we want to support a moral vision of well-being, what can we do? And here I just want to lay out some solutions. So I guess my problem with this idea that we either need to catch out use of AI or keep up with AI, it's quite an individual focus, especially a lot of the burden lies on the students to do the right thing. But I think we need to acknowledge that use or non-use of AI takes place in a kind of broader ecosystem. And who's responsible there? Well, certainly policymakers, technology companies, education researchers, all of these can work together to aim for equal access to safe and non-extractive AI models. But we as educators aren't off the hook. I think we have a lot of responsibility internally in our classrooms and externally as well in our local or maybe even our global community as thought leaders. So, or at least training the next one. So I suggest that there might be some ways that we can lead with compassion and rather than catching out students or trying to keep up with trends. This could look like simply assessing based on the process more than what AI can extract, giving students time and space to experiment and helping them to lead according to futures which matter to them. A few concepts which I want you to think about then. So under this banner of virtue, I suggest we need to think about virtue which relates to solidarity or thinking about the well-being of others, simply. And this could be at the level of individual action. I like things like the AI resource test, which is in the box here, where wherever someone uses AI, you think, are the prompts worth a bottle of water? That's a sort of equivalent of water use for a set number of prompts, for example. Is the generated image worth enough energy to charge a smartphone? But perhaps more powerful would be collective action. So I had this idea I suggested of limits, starting with an assumption of limits. This is something that researcher Neil Selwyn talks about, where we try to shift our thinking from many people to one from each person having one device to many people to one device, for example. And I guess, do we involve students? Do we involve our community in our decisions of when AI is or is not added pedagogical and societal value? That's one thing to think about. Also relevant here is the idea of justice, which is prioritizing AI for the most vulnerable. So I think often when we think of, oh, we need to set limits and think about the environment, sometimes the pushback is, oh, it's easy for you to say, when the people who are most impacted are not the people who are using or benefiting from AI. And so I think it's about setting necessary use in context. So what's necessary use of AI? We can set that assumption of abundance of high frequency, high functioning AI for each person against this more important backdrop of the need for technologies which arise from the uneven distribution of harms, especially environmental harms. So here we could think about AI as emergency educational technologies for those facing barriers to education, or technologies for those who rely on specific aids for their teaching and learning, like assistive technologies, for example. Security and privacy, I think, are also going to be big ideas here. So in all these uses of AI, we want to think about avoiding unwanted collection and use of data and intellectual property, both for ourselves and for our students. And finally here, I just want to end with an example. What does that all look like? Trying to keep all these big concepts in mind when we actually do a course, for example. So for me, what I wanted to try out was teaching digital ethics itself as a kind of service learning course. So what I did was I taught my undergrads digital ethics, but in order for them to then teach secondary school students about digital ethics. And so they did use AI, I didn't ban it, but they were using AI only to prepare material to talk to secondary students about the dangers and the opportunities of AI and technology in general. So there's this kind of dynamic going on where I gave the students responsibility, and this sort of changed how they approached using AI. And in terms of how you assess them, as I said, I focused on character rather than maybe the actual end result. Here's an example of something from the Service Learning Center at my university, where we're thinking about the skills that the students have, things like empathy and self-understanding, social awareness. And there's rubrics that you could consider for this kind of level of assessment. So just want to wrap up this part. And I just want to say that in some ways, my proposal is to develop a moral vision of well-being for AI. But that means charting this path through this dilemma, the pathways of keeping up and catching out. And for us, I'd like to suggest that I would love you to think about whether any of the key ideas covered in the solutions I mentioned connect with resources from your discipline or your position in your institution. So things like wellness, virtues, collective action, justice, and security or privacy. I think you must have a wealth of ideas. I remember I was talking before with some people about the environment, and someone from English literature was talking about poetry, dealing with environmental damage and connecting that with ideas of use of AI in the classroom. And I think that kind of level of engagement is really helpful for our own contexts, because I don't always know what is of a problem or what is the solution for you and your discipline and your area. So yeah, I'd like you to think, perhaps I won't give us too much time because I've talked a long time. Think through these different options. What are the connections with resources in your discipline or your position in your institution? And briefly now at the end, I wanted to talk with you about how to draft a policy. And so We're a big group. I was thinking, oh, maybe we could talk about it, but I think it's difficult for us to be in different small groups today. But I provided at the end of the slides and also as a separate document in the resources, a template for drafting an AI policy. In general, you could perhaps keep it short, especially if you're just using it for your classroom, and keep it simple, trying to communicate the main ideas within and outside of the group. And I've suggested there's different steps, like defining the scope of who it covers in your organization or your classroom. And that's something pretty easy to fit in. The important step that I just want to dwell on is this idea of stating your commitments. So at the very top of that policy, I think if you can provide a short summary of your overall commitment to ethical use of AI, and if that could look beyond just negative commitments which might involve mitigating risks, maybe you can include some positive commitments based on the ideas I've discussed in this webinar. So things like wellness, virtues, collective action, justice, security, and privacy, and so on. And that could be a sort of short statement. Beyond this step, you can start thinking of individual areas of impact. And I would like to remind you to think about the whole life cycle of AI when you do that. Have a review process. I think that's important, especially if we commit to this kind of collective action idea. Who's going to look at it, how regularly, and so on. And then make sure it's shared. Make sure your students, if it's a classroom policy, know about it, especially if it's an institutional one. Have it widely shared. And just to finish off then, does your organization already have an AI policy? If so, maybe you can take some time to compare your draft to what it is. If not, maybe you can think who would need to be involved to create one. And the last question that you can think about is, does a commitment to digital ethics and well-being actually need to be included in other policies? So perhaps you have a green policy for your university. Does that cover things like e-waste or the energy use of certain AI technologies, for example? So a big area, I think, a big area to address, but one which I hope I've given you some high-level theory, thinking about well-being, and also some specific examples of concepts that are of use and ways to design a course and maybe even a policy that you can get started with as well. If you're interested and you want to learn more, my university, together with the United Board, is running a course on digital ethics, an introduction to it, which is a more lengthy look at some of the issues raised today. And there'll be an advanced module coming out soon on this Dear Hub on our university website, and then a load of other resources here too, which you can find on your PDFs. So I realize I've taken a lot of time, so I'm going to stop there. And I really look forward to hearing any questions or thoughts from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, friends. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Rachel. Thank you, Christian. Let's meet again in November.